Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya. Over the weekend, US President Joe Biden hosted his very last Quad summit. This summit setting was a bit unusual because it was held in Biden's hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. It was also partly hosted in Biden's own residence. And present at the summit were all four heads of government, Biden himself, along with Prime Ministers Narendra Modi, Fumio Kishida, and Anthony Albanese. And of course, all of these leaders happened to be in the United States because of the UN General Assembly, but the summit did yield some results. We've seen some politically significant statements, as well as some developments in the maritime domain, as well as potentially some institutionalization of the Quad. To discuss the Quad summit and what we can take away from it, I have with me Manoj Kewalramani. So welcome, Manoj.
Thanks so much, Aditya. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my head around this summit and make sense of it. One thing, just as a broad political context that just occurs to me is, this whole summit is happening at a time when you have some amount of hiccups in the India-US relationship. You have murmurs of this limited rapprochement between India and China. And of course, you have some angst about, the US pursuing these other groupings like the so-called Squad with the Philippines and AUKUS and so on. I'm not sure how significant all of this is, but what are your broad political takeaways from the latest Quad summit?
Right. So, my broad takeaway is that there was a clear emphasis. Two things, right? Firstly, the choice of hosting the summit in Wilmington, Delaware, Biden's hometown, and the US administration was sort of quite far to make this case that, hey, look, this is an indication that he's never held a major summit in his hometown. This is indicative of the commitment that this administration and the US across the board has to the Quad. And if you even read the statement, there is, I think it's taking tremendous effort to try and make the case that the Quad is here for a long period of time to stay, right? It says that we are more strategically aligned than ever before. We aim to have a positive and enduring impact for the Indo-Pacific. It is a grouping that will buttress the Indo-Pacific for decades to come. So they're making this big case that, look, we are here to stay for the long term. And I think Biden and Prime Minister Modi, both in their statements, actually indicated the same thing, right? So everybody is putting their best foot forward to make the case that this is not some, like the Chinese had called it, foam on the seas, right? So this is here to stay. To me, that's the sort of first big takeaway. The fact that the Indian government agreed to US request for the United States to host the summit is also indicative of far more flexibility and far more sort of comfort among these different governments among each other. I think that from the point of view of the tensions between India and the US, the frictions rather than tensions, there are obviously frictions there with regard to what's happened with accusations of the killing of certain individuals in the US. And also Biden met with pro-Khalistani groups in the US at this point of time, and there's a civil case that I think has been filed in an American court. So there are these sources of friction, and I think it's worth acknowledging them. And these, I think, are going to remain, right? Because there are differences between the two countries on specific issues. As far as both countries can recognize that their strategic congruence is far deeper than some of these differences, which are security issues, but they're also deeply political issues in some way. So as far as they can recognize that, yes, there is this political and perhaps even a certain disagreement over values, but our strategic congruence of interest is far deeper and far greater, I think we'll be fine. So I'm not terribly worried about them. Of course, anything can blow up, but as long as your channels of communication on these issues are open, I think it should be fine in my view, because there are bigger stakes at play. Finally, on the China thing that you talked about, India's rapprochement with China, I think that the word thaw has been used a lot in the Indian media. I think we are very far away from a thaw. There's been some talk of, oh, we've achieved 75% disengagement, like the foreign minister said, or like the Chinese said, or we've pulled back troops from 4 friction points. All that happened long time ago. We are still waiting for 2 key friction points to be resolved. And that's just the first step. That's disengagement. There has to then be de-escalation. And then there has to be a whole process of, rebuilding confidence. And we are very, very far away from that. I'm happy that there is some degree of movement in terms of greater dialogue between the two countries, but we are far away from that. And I think that the structural nature of that contest between India and China persists. So in that backdrop, I think the Quad Summit is useful because it's as much as it is about the Indo-Pacific as a region, it's also about shaping the region in a way where you can resist what you see as adverse influence of China.
Right. I mean, I agree with you that I think we're some way away from any kind of meaningful rapprochement with the Chinese. And as far as the Indian angst about AUKUS and so on, well, I mean, if India insists that the Quad is not actually about military matters, there really is no reason to complain. But yes, you mentioned China.
And just to add, the Indian leadership has made this case about multi-alignment, special purpose vehicles, plurilateral groupings. But you're not the only player in the world. Others will also play the same game. So it should be, till they all serve a certain strategic purpose that furthers even your interests. I don't see the harm in it.
Likewise, yeah. The other thing is, of course, Biden's open mic moment where he spoke about China, which, and of course, the Quad is, of course, technically not supposed to be about China at all. But what do you make of that?
I think some open mics are strategically placed. There are some things that you can't say when you are making your official comments. It's useful to have open mics. I mean, I have no particular information on that regard, but it is very, very curious that was the open mic moment.
Yes, it is very curious indeed. All right, so let's just get to the substance of the summit. Optics were obviously quite interesting, but one thing that we've seen is that there's a lot of emphasis on maritime issues. So firstly, there was a very clear statement about maritime aggression and singling out China, and I think that's significant. I'd like to hear what you think. There also seems to be some actual progress on a few maritime issues. Can you run us through them and your analysis of them?
Sure. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised when I was going through the document and went through some of the outcomes, particularly in terms of maritime security. Obviously, at the head of all this is the IPMDA, which is the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Program. And the objective of that is to improve maritime domain awareness across the Indo-Pacific. A lot of it was, it's structured in a way where it's trying to build capacity for countries to particularly monitor their own exclusive economic zones for any unlawful activities targeting IUU, so illegal unregulated fishing. But the challenge has been also that a lot of this fishing happens through Chinese vessels, and they go undetected. And therefore, this was trying to address that, among other things, of course. So for the first time, I think we have at least some clarity on what this initiative is doing. It was announced a couple of years ago. The document talks about how over 24 countries have been provided access to dark vessel maritime domain awareness data. This has been done through providing them with commercially available satellite information. Now, who's procuring these, at what rate they are procuring these, and which are these particular countries, that's not been spelled out. So, but that's at least for the first time we know what's happening. We also know that the 3 domains where this IPMD is operating, it's operating with the Pacific Islands Forum Fisheries Agency. It's operating with, as the statement says, partners in Southeast Asia. And it's operating in congruence with the Information Fusion Center of the Indian Ocean in Gurugram in India. So at least that much we know, which is to me a step forward in knowledge. But I would love to know who's procuring it and at what capabilities. Australia is supposed to be doing much more in this going forward with the Pacific Islands particularly. A couple of new initiatives were launched in the sort of maritime security domain. You had an initiative called Maitri. I wonder if this was an Indian proposal or if this was something that the rest of them thought would be an interesting acronym for to something that would be therefore very, very acceptable to India. My thought is that this would be an Indian proposal. This is called the Maritime Initiative for Training in the Indo-Pacific. Officially, the document says that it aims to maximize tools provided through IPMDA and other Quad initiatives. But essentially, it's enabling countries to enforce laws and secure their waters There'll be a workshop on this next year, which India will be hosting. And some of the conversation will be about a legal dialogue to sort of deal with challenges. So I think that has to do with something around initially capacity building, but also legislative, capability and legislative changes across the region, so that you can track and you can at least deter unlawful activity. There's also a Quad at Sea ship observer mission in 2025, which will begin, which is essentially the 4 Quad countries' coast guards coming together to do a joint activity to improve interoperability. I'm really chuffed to see this because this is something that, at least for the last 2 years, I've been talking about. The fact sheet talks about how the State Department has held these international visitor leadership programs tailor-purposed for the Quad countries. I had the pleasure of being on one of these programs in October 2022, the Maritime Governance Program. And this was one of the key things that I had continuously argued at that point of time. And I'm really happy to see, not claiming ownership of the outcome, just saying that it was one of the ideas that even I was very supportive of. And then, of course, you have a Quad Indo-Pacific logistics network pilot project, which is essentially around supporting civilian responses to natural disasters across the region, which is part of this broader HADR focus that the Quad countries have. So in the maritime domain, I think this is substantive movement forward from where we were 2 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that all of these, I think the maritime domain is really one of the critical components of the Quad and civil maritime domains specifically. So I think this progress is quite heartening. You'd mentioned, who's getting, basically how's the Fusion Center working for Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness? Yeah, I'm assuming they're buying American commercial satellite imagery, which is one of the reasons there's American buy-in for this. I think my suspicion is that the Quad functions primarily on the basis of Indian and American initiatives. My3 might be another such example, and it gets buy-in from the other countries. But okay, so this is really good news. I was also curious to see a statement on Ukraine, and they noted that all 4 leaders had actually visited Ukraine and had some appreciation of the ground situation. What do you make of this? I'm assuming that this didn't come from the Indian side, but some sort of common statement was worked out, right?
Yeah, and clearly, I mean, if you go back to the Hiroshima summit and the statement at the Hiroshima summit on Ukraine, this is stronger and it's much more emphatic in some ways. It reiterates a lot of the similar concerns. It reiterates the need for, the war to end. And I mean, the Hiroshima statement had adopted that statement from Prime Minister Modi about, ours is not an era of war and things like that. This one doesn't have that statement, but it talks about energy, food security, and sort of downstream effects of the war. But it reiterates a couple of times the importance of international law and the UN Charter, which the other one did also once. And it talks about the importance of maintaining territorial integrity and not changing, not using force against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of any other country, or to violate the political independence of any state, which to me is an addition, and it's an indication of, the Americans making the case that the Ukrainians have a free choice, whichever way they want to lean, and nobody should be using force to shape that also, which so it's much stronger. And clearly with the summit being held in the US, it seems like this is the US carrying the day.
Absolutely. I think that was the impression that I got as well. Another thing that was interesting is that, we've talked about the Quad not being institutionalized and, the preference for it not being institutionalized, to not have a permanent secretariat and all. Now, that is not on the cards, but there do seem to be some small baby steps towards institutionalizing it, right? Can you walk us through these things? I mean, even if they're small, even if they're just at the level of, setting up committees domestically, they do seem to be a step forward in the way that the Quad functions, right?
Yeah, no, I think this is more the case. This is more the case in the United States than in other countries. You've seen, I think in the last year there's a legislation which has been passed by, I'm not entirely sure if it's a House Foreign Relations Committee or a Senate committee, but it's been cleared and it's on the table, which is about the Quad. I think it's called the Quad Act or something, but the name escapes me right now. And that legislation will eventually go through. And that is about essentially them demonstrating bipartisan support and also some sort of a reporting mechanism for the administration to Congress on activities of the Quad. The current fact sheet that they issued after this summit talks about how each Quad country and each Quad government will work through their respective budgetary processes to ensure funding for Quad priorities in the region. There's no specific data on what each country spends. So to me, I mean, for somebody like, for us, this is useful because at least you potentially from a year or two onwards, you will start getting some data on who's spending how much, or at least whoever sets up these processes and puts the data in public. I presume the Americans will at least we'll get some data on what's being spent on Quad priorities annually. And hopefully that will answer the question also, who's buying the satellite imagery. There's an interparliamentary exchanges system that's being set up, and the US Congress has announced the creation of a congressional Quad caucus, which is bipartisan. So again, they are creating institutions within the American government system, which is good because it tells you that, as they said in the statement, that the Quad is here to stay. In terms of other activities, you're seeing that there are lots of Quad working groups on different issues, but also there is now a ministerial level expansion that's taking place. So the commerce and industry ministers of the Quad countries will be meeting for the first time. We don't have a date or time frame for this, but they've announced that this will be happening. There's also meetings planned for the development and finance institutions of the Quad countries. So that's taking place. So we're seeing steps being taken. So while none of this is likely to lead to a Quad secretariat or it becoming institutionalized in that sense, and I think again, all administrations have been quite clear that that's not the agenda. But at least these are sort of steps of institutionalizing, so that at least the concerns that people may have that this is something ephemeral can be sort of gone, and you can actually have more structured outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. I think those are the kind of steps we can expect with the Quad. Another thing that I was a bit surprised to see was the Quad Cancer Moonshot. That wasn't the sort of thing that I expected to find in a Quad summit statement. What do you make of it?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, another thing that I was really surprised to see was this Quad Cancer Moonshot, which I didn't expect to see in a Quad summit statement. So, what is your take on it?
So, okay, if I was to be cheeky, I'd say you and a lot of the Australians would not have desired that. But because from what I understand, from the Australian side has not necessarily been really thrilled at the fact that the Quad's moving in all these directions, particularly on health. I mean, one understands where it was going during the pandemic. That was your big concern, but the effort, and also this is an American initiative from what I gather, right? Again, so at least that's what I gather from grapevine and chatter, unattributable grapevine and chatter. I think that this is interesting, right? They're essentially focusing on cervical cancer, and the US is saying that, look, we will be providing support through the US International Development Finance Corporation and through sort of mobilizing private sector participation. The Australian government has committed around 29 million Australian dollars to cover 11 countries in this, supporting them with sort of different ways. India commits to a bunch of HPV sampling kits, detection kits, vaccines, to the tune of around $7.5 million. And Japan also is going to be committing something around $20+ million, 25, something around 27, something like that, for medical equipment. So, they've expanded this healthcare initiative, healthcare sort of vector of the Quad to deal with this. And their objective is that we can, and I don't think that it's necessarily something that the Quad shouldn't do. And I get when people will be critical, saying that, look, if you're going to do everything, then you're doing nothing. But if your goal is to try and make the Quad much more acceptable to populations and governments around the region, then these kinds of outputs and outcomes are actually quite good. Again, it depends on which countries you're servicing and what you're doing. I also feel, and again, with no basis in fact, because I don't know it, but I feel that a lot of this is existing initiatives will be rolled into something, like, say, for example, in the document itself, they talk about, India's 10 million commitment to the WHO's global initiative on digital health. And through that, it will be offering some So there is some existing initiatives also, which will be rolled into this thing. It's not necessarily going to be all new. So there'll be a little bit of, old wine, new bottle, but there'll also be a little bit of newness to it. And I'm not necessarily opposed to it. Somewhere I have made peace with the fact that this is not going to be a military grouping. So I don't mind some of this other stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we can't expect big military decision making to come out of the Quad. It's subjective. But I mean, I am a little concerned that even if these are just old programs being repurposed or rebranded, how they're going to be implemented without some kind of permanent bureaucracy, even if it's a really lean one. So I don't know. That's my note of skepticism on that. But
I agree.
yeah, so I mean, but let's see how initiatives like IPMDA work out over the next few years, and I think that might tell us something about where the Quad needs to go. So Manoj, I think we've covered all the major points to come out of the summit, but can you tell us a sort of big picture takeaway? What can we expect next from the Quad over the next 1 year? Does this give us any sense of where it's headed?
I think that it does, right? I mean, obviously, there's lots that we haven't talked about, which is around tech, cybersecurity, space, many other areas. I didn't see any, and I could be, myopic, but I didn't necessarily see any major announcements in that regard. There are lots of fellowships and things like that, cable connectivity. So there are lots of things that are happening simultaneously. To me, the breadth of what they're doing is quite breathtaking, right? There's so much that's being done, and it's remarkable that 4 countries have so quickly been able to ramp up the scale at which they are working. I think that's tremendous that that's happening. Where it's going, I think that it's going in a direction where it's likely to get much more embedded within the bureaucracies of each countries. Once you have clear budgetary allocations domestically, it becomes much more institutionalized. There's greater accountability, so you're likely to see far more concerted action. So I'm very optimistic after these outcomes, particularly the outcomes of budgetary allocations, parliamentary exchanges, and expansion of exchanges to other ministries. Of course, we'll wait and see what happens with industry and commerce and all these ministries meeting. But I think those are all good signs. The agenda is broadening, and there is outcome that's being achieved. Is it at the strategic scale that we imagined initially when the Quad was sort of upgraded to the leaders level? Perhaps not. But is it something that may build long-term structures and systems that can achieve strategic objectives? Perhaps yes, right? I mean, some of the stuff, healthcare, cables and all, might not seem really sexy, but they are really significant over a long period of time. And if you can't compete on rapidly building stadiums or roads or bridges, doing healthcare and cables and open source security and things like that can be very, very useful.
Right. So I mean, these are basically playing to some of the potential comparative advantages of the Quad countries, especially India. Right. Manoj, I think this has been a really interesting episode. Thank you so much. Of course, we'll keep coming back to you for more analysis on the Quad, you, Vanshika, others. There's also Takshashila's Quad Bulletin. We'll put a link to it. It's a wonderful newsletter that gives you a lowdown on the Quad and all developments connected to it. So thank you once again, and thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
Thanks, Aditya. See you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.